Hello and welcome to this discussion with the Tenaska Trailblazer project. This is Crispin Walker from the project's financial and commercial team with the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute. Today I'll be talking with Jeff James from the Tenaska Development Group, who will be talking us through some of the financial and commercial reports that Tenaska's provided to the Institute. Just by way of introduction, Jeff James is a director within the business development area of Tenaska. He's a trained engineer out of the University of Missouri and has been with Tenaska for a number of years. Without any further ado, I might just hand over to Jeff James to talk us through the Trailblazer project briefly, but also just give us some highlights of some of the three financial and commercial reports that Tenaska's provided to the Institute. So over to you, Jeff.
Oh, thanks, Crispin. Again, my name is Jeff James, and I'm with Tenaska, and I'm responsible for overseeing the development of our Trailblazer Energy Center here at Tenaska. So without further ado, let's get into the presentation. First, I want to give a brief overview to everybody to familiarize themselves with the project. The Trailblazer Energy Center is a new greenfield development plant. It's a pulverized coal unit that will incorporate a supercritical boiler that will utilize Powder River Basin coal from the Wyoming area here in the United States. That coal will be shipped by rail down to the state of Texas where the project's located, and I'll talk a little bit more about that here soon. The project also is going to incorporate post-combustion CO2 capture into the initial design and construction of the facility, and it'll be designed to capture 85 to 90% of the CO2. This CO2 will be then used and sold into the Permian Basin, which is the largest CO2 market in the world, and that CO2 will be used for enhanced oil recovery. It'll be used to produce oil that otherwise would be stranded underground. We'll capture and sell almost 6 million tons of CO2 a year, and that'll be responsible for producing on the order of 11.5 million barrels of incremental oil production each and every year. The total capital costs of the project, including the pulverized coal plant and the carbon capture plant, is right around $4 billion. The project, as I mentioned, is located in Texas. More specifically, that's located near the town of Sweetwater, Texas, which is about 200 miles west of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. So why did we choose West Texas and the site that we're going to construct on? We chose West Texas, as I mentioned, because it's the largest CO2 market in the world, and for the amount of CO2 that we're going to have for sale, we need there to be a market that can absorb the entire quantity that we have. Specifically, why we chose the site that we're at. The site that we have is actually connected to two different railroads. Both railroads run all the way to the Wyoming area where the coal will be mined in the Powder River Basin area. So it provides us competition in the rail transportation business. Also, just a couple miles south of the site, there's a 345 kV electric transmission line that the project will interconnect with. There's also a natural gas pipeline that crosses the site. Natural gas will be used for the startup fuel for the facility. So all the infrastructure that you need for a large project like this exists right here on the 2,400-acre parcel of land that we own just outside the city of Sweetwater. Specifically, I guess, why did we choose the state of Texas? The state of Texas has put some significant incentives in place through the legislative process, and we're hoping to be able to capitalize on those incentives that are out there. And then you couldn't move forward with a project like this unless you had a lot of community support, and we do from the folks there in Sweetwater and Nolan County, and just want to thank the leaders and the community people there for supporting Trailblazer. A little bit about how we got to where we're at today. We announced the project publicly for the first time back in February of 2008. It's been a long path to get to where we're at today, but back in February of 2008, we not only announced the project, but we closed on the purchase of our property. We filed an air permit request with the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, and we also filed an electric interconnect request with ERCOT to connect to the transmission grid. About a year and a half later, we announced an EPC contract with Fluor. Fluor was going to be the EPC contractor for our traditional pulverized coal plant. We still, at this point, hadn't selected who the technology provider would be for the CO2 capture plant. In March of 2010, we announced that Arch Coal had purchased a 35% interest in the project company, and they also became the sole fuel supplier for the project at that point in time under a long-term fuel supply arrangement. We announced the funding agreement with the Global CCS Institute a few months after the Arch deal, and then the very next month that we announced that we had selected Fluor as our CO2 capture technology provider. At that point in time, since we had the same contractor for the CO2 capture plant as well as the pulverized coal plant, we're able to roll those into a single contract with Fluor to be the EPC contractor for the entire project. And then in December of last year, in 2010, we received a final air permit from the TCEQ, which was a major milestone for a project like this. And earlier this year, we announced a water agreement with the city of Stamford. As I mentioned, we have a funding agreement with the, excuse me, with the Global CCS Institute. And under that funding agreement, we've provided the Institute with 10 different lesson learned reports, and those 10 reports kind of fall under 5 topic areas listed here. And today I'm going to focus on the reports that talk about the markets and the financing of the project. The first project, the Bridging the Commercial Gap for Carbon Capture and Storage, will be one I'll highlight here now. And it also, this entire report can be found on the website for the Global CCS Institute. This report will provide an overview of the current markets for electricity and CO2 for the project. Those are the 2 main revenue sources for the project to be able to allow us to finance the project. Also, the project will receive some governmental support, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit on what they have received and where we what other incentives could be out there in the future. And it just the report will kind of give an overall economic view of the project. The report will.
Jeff, I just wanted to just ask a little bit about that commercial gap report.
Yeah.
You were talking about the project being located in Texas. Can you just elaborate a little bit about some of the sort of the market demand there around CO2 for the Permian Basin, but also the unmet demand for electricity through ERCOT, which is the Reliability Council of Texas, the Electricity Reliability Council. I mean, Texas, I think, is doing quite a bit better economically than other parts of the states, and so I'd just like to hear a little bit more about, you know, a bit more about Tenaska's thinking about locating in that market, but still there's a need for governmental incentives to bridge the gap.
Yeah. No, those are good questions. And give me just a second here to get through another slide, and then I've got a slide that's coming up, and I'll kind of talk about the breadth of both of those markets, and I think it'll give the listeners a good feel for it. Briefly, I was just going to mention the other report that we're going to talk about today is the financing the new pulverized coal plant with post-combustion carbon capture, and also this report also can be found on the Global CCS Institute's website, and it'll give a little bit of overview of the markets like the other report, and talk about the gap that exists in the revenues and costs for the project. It'll talk about considerations that we look at when we're going to financing and some of the contracts that have to be in place to make the project financeable. And there's a lot that goes into that when you're financing a $4 billion project. So, getting to your question here, Crispin, talking about both markets. Here's on the left is a map of the Permian Basin highlighted there in the red, the pinkish area, and then on the right in the light blue color is the ERCOT market. The ERCOT market is the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, and that's the market that we're going to be selling our electricity in. And to give you a feel for the size of this market, in ERCOT alone there's over 23 million customers. There's over 78,000 megawatts of generating capacity available to serve those customers, and that capacity is spread out over 550 different generating units. And all those units are connected with 40,000 miles of transmission lines. So you can see the market is pretty deep, and it's going to be able to absorb a project like Trailblazer that will produce about 600 megawatts of electricity. On the CO2 side, the Permian Basin well market consists of about 86,000 square miles, and if I did my math right, Crispin, I think that's close to 138,000 square kilometers. So it's significant out there. The first enhanced oil recovery flood using CO2 was done back in 1972, and since then the Permian Basin has grown to the largest CO2 market in the world, as I mentioned previously. Both markets are big from a supply and demand side, but you also have to have the key infrastructure in place to be able to, for these markets to work, and both of them do. And this slide here kind of depicts that. The picture on the left is a map of the CO2 pipelines serving the Permian Basin. There's over 2,000 miles of pipelines serving that market, and so the infrastructure is there for the CO2 market. As I mentioned earlier, the ERCOT market has over 40,000 miles of transmission lines, and right now the ERCOT market's undergoing an upgrade of almost $7 billion of transmission lines out here in West Texas, and that's highlighted here on the right side of this slide, where that transmission build-out's going. So it's just it's making the market or the transmission infrastructure even more robust on the electric side. Crispin, did that kind of get what you were after there on the market size of both of those?
Yeah, that's spot on. I just wanted to give a sense of how robust the markets were there currently, notwithstanding the sort of global downturn. But it does raise another question, which is you make some good points there, and particularly in the financing report around some of the costs and the revenue issues that you've got there. It obviously raises the issue of risk, which is addressed in the financing report. Can you talk a little bit about how you manage the risk and what the expectation of lenders is for risks of first of a kind project like this?
Yeah, I will. And in fact, if you don't mind, and give me a couple more minutes, I'm going to actually get to a slide on that. So we're on the same page here.
Yep.
But before I get to that, I want to talk a little bit more about the electric and CO2 markets, kind of dive down a little bit deeper. I don't want to get into a lot of details today. But this graph here is a supply stack of all the generation that's dispatched in the ERCOT market. And actually what we've done is projected these dispatch costs out in the summer of July 2015 to see what the future market looks like. On the left-hand side is the cost of each unit and dollars per megawatt hour of the dispatch cost, which basically is the fuel and the variable O&M. What does it cost to run that unit on that given day? And then across the right or across the bottom is the total megawatts. And each square that makes up this graph here represents a generating unit in the ERCOT market. And so you can see the lowest dispatch costs are the nuclear units, followed by the coal units, and then as you get further out to the right, you start getting into gas projects being dispatched. And then even on those peak days on the far right, there are some oil units that can actually be fired and ran. On average, the ERCOT market's around a 40,000 megawatt market, and on a peak day, it's about 70,000 megawatts. So where does Trailblazer fit out in this curve? Well, it's a coal unit, and you would expect its dispatch cost to be similar to other coal units in the market. However, it will be one of the newer units, so it's going to be on the lower side because it's going to be more efficient than some of the older existing coal units. But what drives it down even further on the dispatch curve is every hour that the Trailblazer project's running, it's selling CO2 into the CO2 market. And so you can actually take that revenue and subtract it off your dispatch costs, and Trailblazer will actually get down to where it has zero dispatch costs or actually negative dispatch costs. And because of that, Trailblazer will be able to run every hour that it's physically available in the market, and that's important because it increases the amount of revenues that the project can generate on the electric side. Same time, I want to talk a little bit, dive down a little bit here on the CO2 market. As I mentioned earlier, the project will capture almost 6 million tons a year of CO2, and so is there a project that's deep enough, big enough to absorb that? The amount of CO2 Trailblazer will capture on a daily basis is about 15% of the current supply market in the Permian Basin. At first glance, that's significant, 15%. But if you look at this graph that's been provided to me by Steve Melzer of Melzer Consulting, you can see that the demand over the past few years has actually outstripped the supply. There's a supply shortage in the Permian Basin for CO2. And that shortage continues in the future years, as you can see out there in 2011, 2012, and even 2013. Steve had given this graph to me back this summer when we were working on putting together the report for the Global CCS Institute. So I called him the other day to say, hey, Steve, is this still an accurate depiction of the CO2 market? And he said it is. He goes, what's probably changed a little bit is supply has actually decreased some and demand has actually increased. And so out there in the future years, the gap is even wider today than it was just a few months ago. So can the Permian Basin absorb the CO2 produced by Trailblazer? And we believe the answer to that is yes, it can. Now I want to get into a little bit about the cost of adding CO2 capture to the Trailblazer project. And the easiest way for me to view this is I've kind of lumped the costs into three different buckets. The first cost, that's the obvious one for adding CO2 capture to Trailblazer, is the capital cost. It takes additional capital to construct the facility. For the entire CO2 capture plant, the compressors at the facility, everything, you add all that up, you get close to $1 billion of incremental capital costs. So that's significant. At the same time, when you've added a CO2 capture plant here, you've also increased your operating costs at the facility. And we view that the operating costs will probably increase on the order of $10 to $15 million a year to operate the CO2 capture plant. So those are the two, I guess what I would call the obvious buckets. The third bucket is not truly what you'd say a cost. I guess it's more of an opportunity cost. What is going on here is in the CO2 capture process, a significant amount of steam is used in the CO2 capture process. That steam would otherwise be used to make electricity if you didn't have the CO2 capture process, because you're diverting the steam away from the steam turbine and using it to capture CO2. At the same time, in the CO2 capture plant, you have a significant increase in your auxiliary electric loads at the plant. And so, again, you're reducing the electrical output that you can sell on the grid by using it in the plant. And so if you add up this additional electric auxiliary load with the loss of the steam, you're looking at a reduction of 175 to 200 megawatts of electricity that you would be able to sell in the market each and every day for 20, 30, 40 years. So if you think about what the electric markets are going for out there, that's a significant cost there as well. So you kind of got the three costs there, the operating cost, the energy ability, and the capital cost for adding CO2 capture to a plant. So now you got to come up with a way to recover those costs to be able to allow your project to get approval for financing. And today there's a shortage of that. Today there's a shortage there, and so let me back up here, I guess. So you've got these three buckets of cost that you've got to overcome to be able to allow the project to go to financing. And as I talked about earlier, we're able to sell the CO2 and receive revenues for it. And that's significant, but it's not enough to overcome these three costs that I've talked about. There's also some other revenues that are available for CO2 capture plant at the local and state level, and also at the international level. At the local level, we've received a tax abatement of some of our taxes for the first 10 years of the project from Nolan County. Also, the state of Texas has put some incentives in place that are significant. For the first three projects in Texas that capture more than 70% of its CO2, there will be $100 million in franchise tax credits available for that project. So that's significant, and again, it continues to help close that gap there. And also there's a severance tax reduction for the oil produced using anthropogenic CO2. And that's a 75% reduction of those severance taxes that can go for 30 years. So those are important. They help close the gap, but again, it doesn't close the gap all the way, and there's got to be some way to do that to be able to allow the project to go to financial close. So we think
Jeff, Jeff, just on that topic, you're really looking there at grants, funding agreements, and loan guarantees, aren't you, really, as some of the incentives that governments and others can put in place?
Yeah, that's right. I'll kind of touch on some of those and explain in a little bit more detail on what each of those are here in a second. So I was going to say there's different ways that that gap can close. The first one is oil prices can continue to increase, and so how does that help close the gap? Well, the price that we'll receive for the CO2 is directly tied to the price of oil. If the oil producers can sell their oil for more, then they're able to pay more money for the CO2 to help them get the oil out of the ground. So at increase in oil prices, that can close the gap. The other way to close the gap is with the other major revenue source, and that's with the increase of electric prices there in the ERCOT market. The other thing that you were just mentioning, Crispin, there's also federal policies that can help close that gap, and those are important on first mover projects like Trailblazer. I think in the future there will be technical improvements to the CO2 capture process. There will be less of a risk premium as the technology matures, and I think some of those will help close the gap on the nth project that's built down the road. But the first few projects are going to need some more incentives in place to help overcome that gap. To finance a project like Trailblazer, a $4 billion project, it's important to have very solid contracts in place with all the major contributors to the project. And this slide here just kind of is a rough depiction of some of those major contracts that have to be in place before we can get to a financial close. Obviously, you got to have a contract with your EPC contractor to construct the facility. In this case, that's Fluor. You get your fuel suppliers, Arch Coal. You got to have contracts in place to purchase the power and the CO2, and all that's got to be set up and in place before you can go to the lenders and be able to borrow money to finance a project of this size. At the same time, Tenaska and Arch will also be looking to raise additional equity on the project before it goes to financial close or perhaps at financial close. But Tenaska and Arch will not be providing all the equity required for this project. So it's, as I mentioned, it's you've got a lot of careful contracting to do around the assets. You need to do this contracting with creditworthy counterparties, and you've got to be able to allocate the risk to the right party that's able to mitigate that risk. And so if you look at the previous chart and you say we've got construction risk on this project, who is the best entity to hold that construction risk? Well, it's kind of an obvious case, but it's Fluor. That's our EPC contractor, and you got to make sure that they're creditworthy enough to stand behind the guarantees that they provide to the project. As I mentioned, we'll also seek additional equity partners before or at financial close for the project, and those equity partners, just like the debt providers, will be looking at the strength of the contracts that we have in place around the project. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was some of these federal policies that could help close the gap in the future that you were asking about, Crispin. One mechanism is a cap and trade mechanism. There's not a lot of popularity for that right now in the United States, but back in 2009 there was a bill that passed out of the House of Representatives called the Waxman-Markey bill. And in that cap and trade bill there was significant incentives in place for the first movers like Trailblazer to capture CO2, and those first mover incentives were adequate enough to allow the project to move on to financial close. There also could be a tax credit program that's set up. Currently, there's a Section 45Q tax credit program here in the United States that provides tax credits for each ton of CO2 that's sequestered underground. Those tax credits are not robust, and the program is not set up adequately enough to to finance a $4 billion project. But with some tweaks to that program, it too, I think, could allow to close that gap and allow the project to go to financial close. Loan guarantees, they're out there. I don't think they close the whole gap, but they help close that gap, and they're a piece of the puzzle. Something that was just introduced a few days ago here in the United States, or not introduced, but announced, Senator Bingaman announced that in early 2012 he intends to introduce a clean energy standard bill, and depending on what that bill looks like, that also could help close that gap or close that gap that's there on the project and allow the project to move towards financial close. So, as you can see, there's some different mechanisms out there that could allow the gap to be closed, but there's got to be an economic reason to capture the CO2, and today that just doesn't exist completely for the project to move forward. But we believe that's on the horizon. It's going to happen soon. That's why we're moving forward and getting our contracts in place with our EPC contractor, our fuel supplier, our fuel transportation. So when those incentives are set, Trailblazer will be ready to move to financial close immediately. With that, that kind of closes the comments I had. I've tried to answer those questions you raised throughout the presentation, Crispin, but if there's others, I'd be happy to try to answer them now.
Yeah, Jeff, if you don't mind going back to that diagram that illustrated all of the different partners, yeah, that one. I just wanted to dwell on that for a minute because I think that's a really intriguing diagram because it shows the vast number of inputs that you need to get a project like this up and running. And it's obvious that on the left-hand side column that you've got all of the logistics and the mechanics all worked out pretty well. You know who you need to be talking to and who you need to deal with deals with. But I think on the right-hand side, that's certainly the equity, the lenders, and the government incentives. That's where there's a lot of uncertainty. So I did want to make the point that a lot of these relationships and a lot of Tenaska's perspectives on these relationships and these inputs and outputs basically are covered in a third report, Building a Consortium. So people are interested in hearing a little bit more about some of those relationships and what different suppliers bring to the project itself there in the middle. That's worthwhile having a look at. That's available on the website as well. But I wouldn't mind just delving a little bit more into the equity and the lenders side of things. And it's quite interesting that you've brought on Arch Coal as an equity investor. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about what their motives are for being involved, buying into a project like this. But also, just to reiterate, I mean, the lenders issue as well. What do they need to see to go ahead? Because obviously you're trying to design this as a commercial project, but it's sub-commercial at the moment.
Yeah, so there was a couple things there. The first on Arch, I really hate to speak for Arch on what they're looking for. I can speculate a little bit. Arch is in the business of mining and selling coal, and I think they want to see that continue in the future, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why they're supporting a clean coal project like Trailblazer, but I wouldn't want to speculate any further than that. On the debt side, you were mentioning what the lenders might want to see before they would provide the debt required for the project. Was that the question?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, it's the big thing. We've identified the cost of the project. I mean, we've had Fluor. They've completed a FEED study now. We have a very good handle on what it's going to cost to build this project. We also have a very good feel for what it's going to take to maintain and operate the project from an O&M perspective going forwards. We've got our fuel supply agreement nailed down with Arch. So we've got a significant portion of our costs nailed down. What we've got to get in place before the lenders will provide the money required to move forward is on the revenue side, and it's the power purchase agreement and the CO2 purchase agreement, and those are the key things. It's tough right now to get those in place because we do have that gap that I talked about earlier. I think we're at the point where we're waiting to see what happens on the federal level to understand what those federal incentives are going to be like and how much of the gap they can cover. At that point in time, once we know that, then we're able to go back to the power purchasers, the CO2 purchasers, and we do have conversations with these folks, and there's interest out there. But it's to do those contracts would be kind of getting the cart before the horse. We've got to see what incentives are going to be in place from a federal standpoint to capture the CO2, and then we can go back and nail down the power purchase agreement, the CO2 purchase agreement. And I don't think that that will be difficult at all once there's something done at the federal level. And so once we have those revenue contracts nailed down, that's what we can then take to the lenders and show them. It's like, hey, we've identified all our costs here. Here's our revenue sources. They want to make sure that there's enough revenue coming in each and every year to cover the cost and to retire the debt. And so that's kind of where we're at on dealing with the lenders.
Sure. Well, that's really it from me, Jeff. If you just wanted to go to the last slide, just wanted to say that if people are interested in finding out more about the project, there's the website for the Trailblazer project. There's lots of interesting information there. And just to reiterate that some of those reports covering off the financial and commercial issues are available on the Global Institute website, which you can see at the end as well. So, Jeff, thanks very much for your time today. Appreciate the efforts you guys have put into creating those reports and sharing perspectives from a developer on how to get a first-of-a-kind CCS project up.
Well, thank you, Crispin. Thanks for the opportunity to tell folks about what we're doing at Trailblazer. We're very excited about what we have here, and it's always fun to talk about it and tell people what we're doing.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Goodbye.